Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss these untold stories from history. Today, we uncover one of America's most chilling mysteries: the strange case of an entire kindergarten class that vanished without a trace, leaving behind questions that still haunt us decades later. In the autumn of 1948. In a small American town, tucked between rolling cornfields and long dusty roads, life carried a kind of rhythm that was both simple and deeply reassuring. Families knew one another by name. Neighbors trusted each other's children like their own, and the local schoolhouse stood at the heart of that community. It was a red brick building with tall windows and the sound of laughter echoing from its yard. A1 Room School had once stood there long ago, but now the town had grown enough to build a small elementary with painted classrooms and the promise of modern education. On the edge of the building was the kindergarten room, a cheerful place filled with tiny desks, wooden blocks, and colorful paper cutouts taped proudly to the walls. The teacher was a young woman named Miss Caroline Hall, barely 24 years old, fresh out of teacher's college, with a smile that seemed to warm even the most nervous child. Parents trusted her completely. She lived alone in a boarding house not far from the school and spent many evenings preparing songs and lessons. For her little class, she was the kind of teacher who still believed teaching was not just a job, but a calling. In the autumn that year, she had 17 children in her class, most only 5 years old. Some were sons and daughters of farmers, some of the local shopkeepers, others of the mill workers. Every child wore handmade sweaters or overalls with patches carefully stitched by mothers who took pride in their work. The town itself was the kind of place where doors were rarely locked at night. Families gathered on porches after supper. Men at the diner discussed the coming elections, and women exchanged recipes at church on Sundays. There had been worries in the world beyond the town. The war overseas had ended only a few years earlier, and soldiers had returned to try and build lives again. But here in this quiet corner of America, the focus was on rebuilding families, not reliving the past. The children who filled that kindergarten room represented hope for the future. That October morning began like any other. The sun rose pale and soft through a thin layer of mist. Parents hurried children along the narrow sidewalks, the clatter of lunchboxes rattling against small legs. Mothers kissed their little ones on the head and reminded them to listen to Miss Hall. Children waved goodbye and disappeared through the school doors. No one imagined that this morning would be the last time the town would ever see that kindergarten class together. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 that morning, the school fell into an unusual silence. Other classrooms carried on with reading and arithmetic, but in the kindergarten room, something shifted. Witnesses later remembered that the blinds had been drawn, though no one recalled who had pulled them down. A janitor said he thought he saw Miss Hall leading the children out back toward the small playground, but when he glanced again moments later, the yard was empty, completely still, as though no children had ever been there. When the bell rang for morning recess, the older children spilled into the yard, running and laughing. Teachers watched over them as always, but one teacher noticed something odd. There were no kindergarten children. They were supposed to come outside at least for a few minutes every day to stretch their legs, yet the swings and slides stood untouched. No tiny voices called across the playground. When asked later, she admitted she thought perhaps Miss Hall had chosen to keep them inside for a special lesson. By noon, the silence was impossible to ignore. Mothers began to gather at the school gates, ready to walk their little ones home for lunch. A few kindergartners usually went home early, but this time none appeared. One mother peered through the windows only to find the kindergarten room eerily still. Desks were neatly arranged, books lay open on the table, crayons were scattered mid-coloring as though dropped in haste. The small jackets hung on their hooks, but the children were nowhere to be found. The alarm spread quickly. Teachers rushed through the halls calling Miss Hall's name. The principal, Mr. Gordon Reeves, a stern man with a deep voice, checked every classroom. Every hallway was combed, every closet opened. The boiler room was searched, the gymnasium, the basement, even the attic. No trace, not a single child, not even Miss Hall herself remained in the building. Panic erupted when it became clear this was no ordinary mishap. The local sheriff was called at once. Sheriff Thomas Daly had served the town for nearly 15 years. He was not easily shaken, but the sight that greeted him at the school that day left him pale. He saw the open books, crayons, lying mid-stroke, the abandoned jackets, and felt his stomach twist. Something terrible had happened. He called in every deputy and ordered roadblocks at the edge of town. Automobiles searched dirt roads and horse patrols combed the fields, yet hour after hour passed with no discovery. News traveled fast in small towns, and by evening the story reached the city papers. Families huddled on their porches, whispering in fear. Fathers took rifles down from above fireplaces. Neighbors stood guard at the edges of town. Mothers wept openly in the church hall, where candles were lit for the missing little ones. It was unthinkable. A whole class gone without a trace. How could children vanish in broad daylight without anyone seeing a thing? Rumors soon spread. Some said a stranger's truck had been seen idling near the school. Others whispered of traveling salesmen or men just back from the war who carried dark secrets. A few blamed Miss Hall herself, claiming she must have lost her mind and led the children astray, yet no one truly believed it. Her gentle nature and devotion to her students made that impossible. Parents remembered how she had cared for their children as though they were her own. Still, her disappearance alongside them left the town with more questions than answers. The federal authorities were soon brought in. Reporters swarmed the town, demanding answers. Photographs of the missing children were printed on front pages across America. Their small, round faces stared back at the nation. Families clung to hope that maybe they had been taken but were alive somewhere, perhaps far away. But days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. With no sign, no ransom note, no clue, the kindergarten class had simply vanished. Tragedy weighed heavy on the nation. It was called the Case of the Vanishing Kindergarten. Papers from New York to California carried updates. Churches across America prayed for the children. President Truman himself was said to have been briefed, though the country was no stranger to sorrow after the war. The mystery of 17 vanished children struck a nerve. It was innocence stolen in a way no one could comprehend. For the families left behind, life became unbearable. Mothers would keep the bedrooms tidy, just as they had been left. Small shoes lined up neatly, untouched toys sitting in corners gathering dust. Fathers often wandered fields late into the night, lanterns in hand, searching again and again, even when they knew it was hopeless. For many, the sorrow never healed. It simply became part of their days. And yet, 27 years later, something would happen that forced the town, and indeed the country, to relive that dark chapter. A mother who had lost her little boy in that class spotted something unusual in a photograph. Far from home, it was small, so small she nearly dismissed it, yet it stirred something in her heart, a feeling she could not ignore. It would set off a chain of events that would reopen old wounds and reignite the search for truth. The mother's name was Ruth Collins. She had been only 26 when she kissed her little boy Danny goodbye that October morning in 1948. He was her only child, a blond-haired boy with freckles across his cheeks who loved to run barefoot through the fields behind their home. Ruth had waited at the school gates that terrible day, clutching a lunch pail she had packed with sandwiches and an apple. She remembered the moment when she realized Danny would not come out with the others. Remembered how her heart had seemed to fall straight out of her chest. Now 27 years had passed. Ruth was older, her hair streaked with gray, her face marked with the lines of sorrow that never truly left. Yet, in all those years, she never stopped searching. She had written letters to officials, begged detectives to keep looking, even traveled to nearby states, chasing rumors. Every trail had ended in silence, but her mother's heart never stopped hoping. In 1975, Ruth lived in Chicago. She had remarried. But Danny's memory lived in her every day. One afternoon, while visiting a small antique shop in a quiet neighborhood, she came across a stack of old photographs. The shopkeeper told her they had been bought at an estate sale. Ruth flipped through them absent-mindedly at first, pictures of farms, picnics, parades. Then one image made her hand freeze. It was a faded black and white group photograph of young men standing in front of a wooden building. They looked to be about their early 20s. Dressed in plain shirts and trousers, but what caught Ruth's breath was the face of one of them. He had the same wide-set eyes, same freckles across his nose, the same stubborn tilt of the chin. As her Danny, Ruth felt her knees weaken. She pressed the photo to her chest and whispered her son's name. The shopkeeper looked at her strangely, but she ignored him. She bought the photograph and hurried home that evening, staring at it again and again. Could it be possible? Could her Danny somehow be alive after all these years? He would be 32 now, and the boy in the picture looked no older than 20, but the deep resemblance was too strong to ignore. She remembered something her husband once said, that grief can play tricks on the eyes. But deep down, Ruth knew what a mother knows. She brought the photograph to the authorities at once. The Chicago police listened politely, but seemed doubtful. The missing kindergarten case was old, older than many of the officers in the room. One detective even muttered that perhaps Ruth was clinging to shadows, but another younger officer named David Russell felt compelled to listen more closely. He studied the photograph and agreed there was something unusual. He promised Ruth he would at least make a few calls and quietly began his own search. Detective Russell traced the photograph back to the estate sale. It had belonged to a man named Henry Wallace, who had passed away without family. The photograph had been found in a trunk, along with letters, maps, and receipts. One letter in particular caught Russell's attention. It was dated 1952 and described a place deep in the mountains of Montana. It mentioned children being raised away from the world and a woman named Caroline watching over them. Russell's heart skipped. Caroline. Could it be Miss Hall, the young teacher who had vanished with the class nearly 30 years earlier? He contacted Ruth at once and showed her the letter. Ruth wept openly when she saw the name. It was as though time had folded in on itself. All those years, she had been told, Miss Hall must have been a victim like the children. Yet here was a letter suggesting she had lived and perhaps had even been with them in secret. The discovery reopened wounds, not just for Ruth, but for the entire town where it all began. The story broke in the newspapers. Once again, reporters who had grown up hearing about the case flocked to cover the new lead. Some dismissed it as wishful thinking, but others believed the nation was finally on the brink of answers. The FBI reopened its files on the case, and Detective Russell was invited to assist. It became not just an investigation, but a mission to uncover a piece of lost American history. The search led investigators west toward Montana. The journey itself stirred something in the American imagination. The wide-open plains, the mountains that seemed to touch the heavens, the old logging trails where few outsiders ever walked. It was the kind of rugged land where secrets could be buried for decades. The team traveled by jeep, carrying the old letters and photographs as guides. Every mile closer to the mountains, Ruth felt her heart pound. She had insisted on going with them, though she was no longer young. She told Russell she had waited 27 years and would not sit home waiting again. When they arrived at the small Montana town mentioned in the letter, they found a place barely changed since the 1950s. Wooden storefronts lined a single street. A gas station sat at the edge. A diner buzzed with locals who eyed strangers suspiciously. At first, no one wanted to talk about a woman named Caroline. But when Russell showed the photograph of the young men, one old farmer's face turned pale. He said he remembered them working in the fields many years ago. He remembered to a woman who led them, a woman with dark hair who they called Miss Caroline. He claimed she had lived on a farm outside town with several children who never seemed to attend local schools. The farm was long abandoned, but the investigators went there anyway. What they found made their blood run cold. The farmhouse still stood, though the roof sagged and weeds grew thick around it. Inside, they discovered children's drawings pinned to the walls, faded and crumbling crayons lay on a shelf, jars of dried paste scattered on a table as though a class had once been held. There in the back room were 17 small beds, neatly arranged, though the sheets had long since rotted. It was as if time had stopped. The kindergarten had been rebuilt here in secret, far from the eyes of the world. Ruth stood in the doorway of that room, tears streaming down her face. She whispered Danny's name again and again. The weight of years bore down on her, but also a flicker of hope. Whoever had slept in those beds had lived, at least for a time. They had grown, they had drawn pictures, they had left behind proof of their existence. It was not the grave she had long feared it. Was life? Detective Russell pressed deeper, searching through the remains of the farmhouse. In a hidden chest beneath the floorboards, they found more photographs. Each showed the children older than they had been in 1948, growing year by year under Miss Caroline's watchful eye. The photos were carefully labeled with dates from 1950 to 1963. Then they stopped. Abruptly, as though the story had ended, Russell studied each face. Ruth nearly collapsed when she saw the boy she knew to be Danny. The same eyes, the same smile now on the face of a teenager. It was undeniable. Her son had lived. The nation erupted when the photographs were revealed. Newspapers printed them side by side with the images of the vanished 5-year-olds. The resemblance was unmistakable. America was stunned. The question was no longer whether the children had lived, but what had become of them. Where had they gone after 1963? Why had Miss Caroline hidden them away? What purpose could such a life serve? The investigation widened. Reports began to surface of strangers who had once passed through the Montana town, men who spoke little and bought supplies in bulk. Neighbors remembered hearing children singing deep in the woods at night, though no children lived nearby. Some whispered about a religious group, others about a government experiment. There was no clear answer, only fragments of memory, scattered like ashes in the wind. For Ruth, each new clue was both a gift and a torment. She could not rest knowing Danny had lived without her all those years. She imagined him blowing out birthday candles in a place she had never seen. She imagined him growing taller, stronger, while she sat in silence at home. The cold air in Montana carried a kind of silence that seemed almost unnatural at night. It pressed in on the investigators as they made their way deeper into the mountains, led only by the clues left behind in the abandoned farmhouse. Ruth Collins wrapped her coat tightly around her shoulders, clutching the photographs of her son like they were holy scripture. She had waited nearly 3 decades to see proof that he had lived, and now every step she took was a step closer to the truth. Detective Russell walked beside her, scanning the tree line with a flashlight that cut through the darkness like a blade. Their small group of searchers felt both anxious and determined, knowing that what they might uncover would shock not just them, but an entire nation. The next morning, they began their search at dawn, following a trail that locals said once led to an old logging camp. The road was barely passable, overgrown with weeds and blocked by fallen trees, yet they pushed forward until they reached a clearing where crumbling cabins still stood. The cabins had long been abandoned, but inside they found more traces of children scratched into the wooden walls were names carved in uneven letters: Danny, Paul, Sarah, Margaret, and others, all names that matched the missing kindergarten class. Each carving was dated, and some included tiny drawings of flowers, stars, or little houses. It was as if the children had tried to leave their mark on the world in the only way they could. Ruth reached out and touched the name of her son carved into the wood. Her hand trembled as tears blurred her vision. She whispered softly that she had never stopped looking for him and never would. The investigators gave her a moment of silence, but in that moment everyone felt the weight of history pressing on them. These were not just names on a wall. They were the voices of children lost to time, yet still speaking in their own way. As they searched further, Russell found an old notebook hidden beneath floorboards. Its pages were worn and brittle, but still legible. written in a neat hand. It appeared to be Miss Caroline's diary. The entries began in late 1948, only weeks after the class had vanished. She wrote of how she could not allow the children to grow up in a broken world, scarred by war and greed. She wrote of how society was failing and how she had been chosen to protect innocence by raising them away from the influence of outsiders. Her words were filled with conviction, but also an unsettling tone, as though she believed she was saving them from something the rest of the world could not see. Entry after entry described their daily lives. She wrote about teaching them to read by the fire, about planting gardens in spring, about punishing those who disobeyed. She spoke of herself not as a teacher, but as a guardian, even a mother to all of them. The diary revealed how she had built a life for them in secret, sustained by supplies bought in nearby towns and by the labor of the older children as they grew. It was both heartbreaking and chilling to read. For Ruth, it was proof that her son had lived, but also proof that he had been taken into a world shaped by the beliefs of one troubled woman. The later entries grew darker. Miss Caroline wrote of fear of being discovered, of the children growing restless, of some wanting to leave. She wrote of arguments and sickness, of nights when she heard voices in the forest. She seemed to believe others were watching them, perhaps threatening to take the children away. The final entries stopped abruptly in 1963. The last page carried only a single line written in hurried script. "They are not safe here anymore." That sentence hung in the air like a ghost. No one knew what it meant. Had she moved them deeper into the wilderness? Had someone come and taken them? Had something terrible happened? The investigators felt both closer and further from the truth at the same time. The FBI decided to expand the search beyond Montana, following whispers from locals who claimed that in the mid-1960s a group of children and a woman had been seen boarding a train headed east. Witnesses remembered them because the children seemed unusually quiet, walking in perfect lines, as if drilled. Ruth clung to this story with desperate hope. She imagined Danny among them, tall now, his hand in his teacher's, as they stepped onto the train. The trail led them across states, through small towns where rumors lingered, but proof was scarce, some said. The children had been seen working on farms in the Dakotas. Others claimed they joined a commune in Colorado. In each place, fragments of memory surfaced like scattered puzzle pieces, but none fit neatly together. The more they searched, the more it seemed the truth was being pulled further away. For Ruth, every mile traveled was another reminder of years lost. She often sat in motel rooms, staring at the photographs, whispering to her son, asking if he was alive, if he could feel her still searching. For him, Detective Russell, though younger than Ruth, had grown deeply protective of her. He admired her strength, her refusal to give up, and he, too, became consumed by the case. It was no longer just about history or mystery. It was about restoring a mother's stolen years. Months passed, and the investigation turned to frustration. The nation watched with fascination. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the search for the vanished class. Television shows debated theories. Some experts said Miss Caroline had been delusional. Others suggested a secretive group had used her to gather the children. Still others whispered of darker explanations, government experiments, or hidden communities that thrived on stolen lives. For many Americans, it became a haunting symbol of how innocence could vanish even in the heart of their own country. Then, in the summer of 1976, a breakthrough came. A man in his early 30s was arrested in Nebraska for petty theft. During routine questioning, he mentioned he had no birth certificate, no record of schooling, nothing before the age of about 10. When pressed, he admitted he had grown up in the mountains of Montana under a woman named Caroline. He said she had told them the outside world was poisoned, that people beyond the forest were dangerous. He had believed her until one night he and 2 others ran away, never to return. The FBI rushed to speak with him. His name now was Joseph, but he confessed that long ago he had been called Paul, one of the 17 kindergarten children. His story spilled out in halting words. He described the farmhouse, the gardens, the songs. Miss Caroline taught them. He described her fierce love, but also her strict control, how she punished those who asked. About their parents, he said, she called them her family, and made them promise never to speak of the world they had left according. To Joseph, things began to change as they grew older. Some questioned her, some wanted to see towns beyond the valley. Miss Caroline grew fearful and angry. She insisted they were chosen. The story of the vanished kindergarten class once again gripped the nation when Joseph finally spoke. Television anchors trembled as they read his words, and newspapers printed his confession across front pages. Mothers who had lost children sat by their radios and televisions just as they had in 1948. Hearts ached at the thought that the missing might still be alive. Ruth Collins carried Joseph's words like a fragile ember. Her son Danny had lived until at least 1963. She pictured him, grown taller, stronger, smiling as a young man. She mourned the lost birthdays and summers, but clung to hope that he was still out there guided by Joseph. The FBI searched mountains and valleys, finding traces of life. A rusted pot by a stream, a blanket half buried, a swing tied to a tree. Each clue carried the children's presence. Joseph described their final march through the woods, led by Miss Caroline, urging them forward under starlight. Ruth pressed a hand to her heart, imagining Danny. Among them, the trail led east. Caroline was seen buying train tickets with silent children in 1964. Reports spread of strange groups living on farms or in communes. Rumors swirled from secret programs to hidden communities, but truth stayed out of reach. Ruth never stopped. She appeared on television, holding Danny's picture, telling America a mother never gives up. In 1977, a woman in Ohio came forward. She remembered living in Caroline's farmhouse. Her name changed, her past erased. She described gardens, songs, punishments, and a blonde boy with freckles named Danny. Her memories confirmed Joseph's stories. Caroline had kept the children close through fear and love, teaching them while telling them the outside world would harm them. Before her death, she placed some quietly into new families. For Ruth, this testimony was both hope and torment. She clung to the mention of Danny, but no one knew his fate. Some were absorbed into other lives, some disappeared completely, yet she pressed on, becoming the face of the search. By the 1980s, the story faded. The survivors tried to rebuild. Joseph disappeared into obscurity. The Ohio woman moved away. Reporters turned elsewhere. Ruth carried Danny's photograph until she died in 1989, never knowing the truth, but leaving a legacy of perseverance. Even now, historians debate Miss Caroline. Was she protector or captor, troubled or manipulative? Whatever the truth, the scars remain. The children who survived carried broken childhoods. Some built quiet lives, others struggled, but all remembered a boy named Danny who stood tall and gave them hope. Perhaps he lived under another name. Perhaps his story ended long ago. We may never know. The trail is scattered in fragments, memories, photographs, scraps of testimony. The rest is silence. And so the strange case of the missing kindergarten class remains both solved and unsolved. A story of innocence stolen, of mothers who never gave up, and of hope that refused to die. Even today, in small towns where old schoolhouses still stand, the whispers linger, reminding us how fragile childhood truly is.